What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Sit Down Saturday, and today we're going to discuss the Netflix Transformers Kingdom. We did Earthrise, we did Siege, so it's only right that we conclude with the third part of the trilogy and wrap it up if this is indeed the last section, which it may not be. So we're going to talk about kind of the universe that it is set up, because now the universe is established, right? So we're going to talk about the universe that they've set up. We're going to talk about like some kind of Easter eggs and fun facts and trivia kind of stuff. We're going to talk about a conspiracy theory regarding Hasbro, their toy lines, and how that has affected the story and how it has affected how they've done business and the writing and the direction and all of it. Perhaps. It's tinfoil hat day, if you know what I mean. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some good, bad, and ugly and kind of a review in terms of what I thought about it. This is going to be spoilerific. I don't have the patience, I don't think, anymore to separate spoiler-free and spoilers. It's going to have spoilers in it. If you haven't seen it, feel free to click out, come back later. If you have seen it, then enjoy the ride. Or maybe you haven't seen it and you don't care about spoilers, in which case, also enjoy the ride. Very minimal housekeeping. The Night Beat, some people said it doesn't remind them of Night Beat, and that I can understand that, but I think that my view of Night Beat is so highly affected by IDW that I kind of have this blend of what he's supposed to look like in my head, and as a result, it doesn't really stay true to any one form. It just kind of feels enough in the character for me, I guess. And then secondly, the Iron Factory Scourge. Some people were like, it's silly to ask for a stand. Like, let me tell you how negotiations work. You push for a lot, they give a little, you push a little bit more, and you meet in the middle of that. Some of y'all got Stockholm Syndrome out there. Stay away from me. A precedent has been set with New Age. They've included stands and flight stands for multiple variations of flying characters. I feel like this is an obvious one that they should have included. That's my personal opinion. If you don't feel like it needs it, then be happy with your purchase. And lastly, the Magic Square versus New Age Shockwaves. A lot of people were like, I like the New Age better, even though it technically lost the battle. And my answer to that is, me too. I do too. That's the interesting thing about the kind of verses. I mean, I like the Maytoy Seeker better than the Takara Seeker. You know, like, that's the interesting thing about verses. What you like isn't necessarily technically an overall better thing if everything is graded in ways equally. Some things don't. Like, to me, the price doesn't necessarily mean as much to me as the build. The hardware doesn't necessarily mean as much to me as the materials. The accuracy certainly doesn't mean anything to me, etc., etc. And I think that's it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Once again, this is going to have spoilers, but let's get started. So let's do an overall kind of look at what this universe really is now that we know the answers. The exact pre-war details of the universe are kept deliberately somewhat vague. The Cybertronian race was enslaved by the Quintessons, who sold them into slavery a la G1 and divided them into classes a la IDW. Most Carbots were better off than those who were industrial, like the tanks and jets. Megatron was born a slave who fought his way to infamy in the Kaon arena. He was one of the first to inspire the lower classes to rebel. Optimus Prime, then Orion Pax, was much better off, but desired a peaceful solution to the class system. Alpha Trion brought Megatron, Pax, Ultra Magnus, and Elita 1 together to bring about a rebellion. The Quintesson magistrate Decius claimed to have played a role in the uprising, believing the Cybertronians deserved freedom. He was cast out as a fugitive of the Quintesson Empire. We meet him in Earthrise when one of his personalities, the Face of Wrath, kills his other selves and attempts to deliver Prime's crew to the Quintesson Empire as redemption. Megatron started as a hero, being the rebellion's leader, alongside Magnus, Elita 1, and Prime. This rebellion ended at the Battle of Tarnhauser Gate, Tarn being a notable Transformer city. Sometime after, Megatron attempted a coup and murdered Alpha Trion. The Civil War began when Prime broke off, who refused to accept dictatorship. Thus, the Decepticon state and the Autobot resistance were born. Leadership was somewhat thrust upon this version of Prime, who doesn't entirely want it when the trilogy begins. He yearns for his old life with Elita 1. Megatron, meanwhile, feels his three closest friends and mentor betrayed him. In the previous seasons, we saw the Autobots and Decepticons at a turning point between a truce and never-ending war, presenting younger versions of Prime and Megatron intending to grow along the trilogy. This was in Siege. In Earthrise, we saw Prime and the Autobots travel across space in search of the Allspark as Megatron goes further and further in his efforts to keep the Cybertronian race alive. Prime grapples with his own demons, and both leaders take steps toward their most classic selves. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the Easter eggs and kind of trivia stuff that we see in this season. It marks the first major crossover between G1 and Beast Wars. When the original Beast Wars began, the writers had little knowledge of Transformers, contrary to some popular fan beliefs. After some fans questioned Primal's mention of a great war, they dove into the lore and began shaping the series as a direct sequel to G1. The production schedule meant that explicit G1 references occurred early on in the show. But this version, in contrast,
to the original Beast Wars, although keeps the basic premise, changes a lot of details. Here, the Maximals and Predacons are from a post-apocalyptic future where the Allspark never returned to Cybertron. They live in fear of Galvatron and Nemesis Prime. In this future, Prime continued down the unsteady path he was on in Siege and Earthrise, never finding the Allspark. The Nemesis and Arc crashed to Earth a la G1, and they remain in stasis for millions of years, with events similar to the G1 tune playing out. Prime and Megatron die in a climatic battle akin to the 86 movie. Both were reformatted by Unicron into Galvatron and Nemesis Prime. Unicron is seeking to destroy what remains of Cybertron. Galvatron and Nemesis hatch a plan to change their own future and free themselves from enslavement, briefly escaping through the dead universe. Galvatron records his entire life as Megatron on the Golden Disc. Managing to decrypt a small part of its contents, the Predacon Megatron travels through time to deliver it to the original Megatron, interrupting the critical point where the Autobots and Decepticons crash and go into stasis a la G1. When Megatron enters the dead universe during Earthrise, Galvatron is able to appear to him, telling him to find the disc and change the future. In this way, the Beast Wars is recontextualized to tie into the crux of this trilogy. Prime taking the Allspark off-world in Siege and the consequences of this drastic action. The majority of Season 1 Beast Wars cast appear and are mostly close in personalities to their original selves. The only major omissions are Waspinator, Pterosaur, and Tarantulas. The only significant alteration is Beast Wars Megatron. In the original, Megatron was an incredibly dangerous, calculating, sarcastic mastermind with a dry sense of humor. This incarnation is a devout worshiper of Megatron, and like all from his timeline, blames Prime for the ruin of Cybertron. He is also by far furthest in terms of voice. The Ark crashes in a volcanic mountain, a la G1. The Maximals initially think they were followed by Nemesis Prime and attack the Autobots. Primal mentions the Axelon, the Maximals' crash ship, as seen throughout the Beast Wars cartoon. Another interesting note to the original Beast Wars is that Primal mentions over 200 other crew members who perished, a nod to numerous protoforms aboard the Maximal ship in the 96 series. It was also nice to see Laserbeak and Air Razor's duel, since she often served as the Maximal spy in the sky like Laserbeak did for the Decepticons in G1. Another kind of nod to the past is Dinobot's Arc, which is a parallel to the original one from 96. However, I will touch a bit more on that here in a bit. But in terms of the story, the Allspark is dying without Cybertron, sharing a symbiotic relationship with the planet and having a mind of its own. Considering what this series borrows from IDW and Aligned, it's safe to assume the Primus Unicron backstory applies, with Primus's essence being sealed within the Allspark. Likewise, Unicron is an all-seeing demonic figure who can peer across time and space, again, mixing G1 with lore of the backstory that came after. An interesting note on Galvatron is that while he is very similar to his 86 self in personality and voice, he also borrows from the Marvel UK comics. In those stories, Galvatron appeared alongside Optimus and Megatron as a time-displaced future version of Megatron, trying to free himself from Unicron. This resulted in various shenanigans, most famously the Target 2006 story, which is regarded as one of the greatest stories in Transformers history, to many. Also, at the end of the show, the Autobots and Decepticons jointly build statues commemorating the fallen troops of each side. For the Autobots and Reflector for the Decepticons. Both characters' body types appeared in droves as generic foot soldiers throughout the show. And then lastly, we see Unicron reformatting Galvatron and Nemesis and is still plotting to take out Cybertron. It is likely that any future continuation will dive into their backstory. Now, behind the scenes stuff, FJ DeSanto has publicly said he fought for more episodes this season and did not want just 6 for this ending story. However, Netflix absolutely refused. And while DeSanto has said the story was largely not dictated by Hasbro, it still had to tie into the toy line. For example, each series features the toy line's respective Titan class figure, etc. Siege had to follow the premise of the Autobots' last days on Cybertron. Earthrise had to be a space adventure. This series was a lot more convoluted than the other two, but has also long been rumored that the Beast Wars characters were not supposed to be a part of the final chapter of the War for Cybertron trilogy. The rumors say John Warden and the Transformers team wanted to do this for the show's anniversary, but could not convince Hasbro's upper management that Organic Beast would sell well. And so the War for Cybertron toy line was to feature the siege of Cybertron, the race to Earth, and a time-traveling crossover with the 86 characters. This would explain the seemingly random inclusion of figures like Springer in Siege and Arcee in Earthrise. They were prepping for the final full crossover with Chapter 3. These rumors say that after the surprise success of Siege toy line, Hasbro's upper management were convinced. The final chapter was changed to feature a time travel crossover with the Beast Wars characters instead. The design and planned 86 figures were divided between Kingdom and the newly created Studio Series 86. This would explain why the Studio Series 86 figures are not built like usual Studio Series Bayverse figures. They instead are near identical in style to the War for Cybertron figures. It also explains the seemingly random shuffling of 86 characters between the two toy lines. For example, Hot Rod, Cup, and Blur are Studio Series, while Ultra Magnus, RC, and even Rodimus Prime are Kingdom. Cyclonus and Galvatron are Kingdom, while Scourge is Studio Series. The odd breakup can be seen with several other figures too. We're proposing the reason this season felt so rushed was because the writing team had to reshuffle and rewrite the already begun story. Siege would have already been well into production by the time of this, to feature the Beast Wars stuff instead. This also explains the similarity with the classic Marvel UK stories, which featured a time-traveling 86 Autobot crew trying to stop Galvatron changing the past. This is all speculation, but the evidence is there, at least to form a theory.
Does that seem to line up to you guys? It certainly lines up to me. The branding there is so curious that I can't help but wonder if that wasn't the case. I might have the option to actually validate it, so we'll get there eventually, but not right now. So let's do our typical the good, the bad, and the ugly. Unfortunately, that does mean ending with the ugly, but we'll try to end it on a positive note. As for the good, I think this is a much better way to introduce the Beast Wars characters and actually make the Beast Wars characters remain meaningful to the G1 fans. It's a smarter, more purposeful, more interesting way to do it, and actually has more defined ligaments and tendons back to the source material of the origination or origin of the franchise. Rather than the 96 Beast Wars cartoon where G1 becomes kind of an afterthought, this one is a direct link in, and as a result, as a G1 fan, I found myself more interested in the Beast Wars characters. Now, I also think that the Beast Wars characters are less cartoony in this than they are in the 96 version, because they're not going after the same demographic as they were in the 96 version, and I think it does the characters a benefit. Now, I know that some people are probably going to be bent out of shape about the representation of Beast Wars Megatron, but you know what? I personally like it better, although it is a little bit more Tarn-ish, and I'd rather just have Tarn. I still enjoy this version better than the... that's just not for me. So I, for once in my Transformers fandom existence, enjoyed the Beast Wars element. While we're on representations, is this the best representation of a Bumblebee that we've ever gotten? A competent supporting character that kind of knows his place but has aspirations for something bigger and is willing to step up to the plate in order to accomplish it? A kind of competent Autobot, young in his sort of military career, for a lack of a better term. The only other one that I could compare to would be the IDW representation when he got into like the Mustang or whatever that thing was, the Camaro with the cane and all that. But I mean, this is a pretty good representation of Bumblebee, and perhaps top 3 representations for me. And I don't think number 3. And then to conclude kind of representations, it seems like Black Arachnia is into chicks, and now I can relate to a Beast Wars character, because so am I. I think it was an interesting standoff at the end with Prime and Primal seemingly versus Nemesis Prime, Galvatron, and Megatron. I would have liked to have explored that a bit more, but instead you kind of get all of the Autobots and Decepticons teaming up, which is a feel-good moment that'll kind of tie into my bad if I'm going to tie those two together, but the ending itself is a bit anticlimactic in how they deal with the main villains. When the kind of chess pieces were laid out on the board, I was like, oh wow, this has a really potential kind of impactful and interesting ending here, and then it kind of fizzled out for me. But I do think it was interesting and still played out kind of cool about like Megatron knowing his future self was Galvatron, Optimus knowing that his future self was Nemesis. Like, just the dynamics of that is an interesting one and a unique one. So I did dig that. And I'll tell you something else that was unexpected was I would have bet a paycheck that this thing would have climaxed with the Titan Arc fighting Unicron in some way. Mainly just as a support rollout for the Arc bot that's just kind of recently, released. And you know what? They didn't do it. It seems like the obvious way to go, and they didn't. And I have to tip my hat to them for that. That's not to say that I was entirely satisfied with the ending, but at least it wasn't utterly predictable for me. Now, while we're on the topic of predictability, let's transition into the bad. While I think they did a lot of unique things with the Beast Wars character, they kind of fall into some of the similar character tropes. For instance, Dinobot. Like, I would have much rather seen something more unique for him that was in the spirit, where it wasn't almost like he has to go through these steps in every iteration of Dinobot. That was kind of a bummer for me. They did a lot of new and kind of bold things, I think, in this season, and I would have preferred them do the same with Dinobot. I feel like even though it's a lot going on, that they still kind of managed to stretch it out. I think that 5 episodes would have been a more cohesive, kind of tighter story. I'm not sure that they needed all that time. If they did need all that time, it was probably because of all the gaps between words in the dialogue between most of the lead characters, specifically Optimus Prime, who goes out of his way to say everything like this over the course of 6 episodes within 3 seasons of this show. As I mentioned previously, the ending is a little anticlimactic with how they deal with the main villains, like the kind of ghost things just sort of zapping them away. It was just like, wait, what? That's the final fight? You know, boring, snooze alert, you know what I mean? So that was kind of a bummer. And you know what? Not for nothing, if they were gonna do the arc fighting the Nemesis, it would have been cool to see the Nemesis transform into something and have that kind of standoff. I feel like that was a overlooked possibility, you know, a waste of an opportunity, really. And then the ugly is really the length of the pauses between words and some of the dialogue. And then lastly, this animation is fine. I've gotten used to it. However, when it's in the darker areas, it's like harder to see and harder to keep up with for me. Maybe it's just me being 40 and being old and trash. But like, I much preferred it when they were like in the dead space or on the Cybertron, and you know, it's more lit and you could kind of see what was going on and have a clear view of the characters. Like, everything is so in shadow and dark and gritty, and you can tell a dark, gritty story with the lights on. Dark is supposed to be a figurative thing, not a literal thing. And that's it, really. For the future of it, I would imagine they're gonna go either like the Japanese route with characters or a complete like Armada, like something completely different. Overall, I give it a 7.5. It's probably my favorite season of the 3. I think that I might be in the minority there, but while I think that the previous 2 seasons lacked a lot of kind of spirit and soul, I do feel like a little bit was in this, even though I smell corporate hands meddling with it. So I don't know how else to grade it other than I thought it was worth a watch. And I thought it was a nice conclusion, and I thought there were some more interesting concepts brought into this one that we hadn't seen in the previous. I would prefer in the future that they take more chances while staying true to the spirit. I don't need to see the same story over and over and over again. I like new stories based on old concepts. A la IDW, and a la something else that we'll be getting into on Nerd Rage next week. And that's that. Special shout out to Andy, who has helped me more than he ever should or I deserve. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.